Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, August 14th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, who says the federal government should own part of a private company? That's no longer a theoretical question. Plus, as government takes a bigger role in shaping emerging technologies, Congress is trying to write rules for one that's changing faster than the legislative process. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Defense Department is asking Congress for broad new authority to directly sell military real estate, lease it back when it needs to, and reinvest the cash from these sales into a number of defense priorities. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
This sounds like a really interesting proposal. What exactly is DoD trying to do here, and what is it asking Congress for?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So DoD wants Congress to give it the authority to sell its own property. Right now, DoD can't do that. If it wants to sell its property, it needs to go through the General Services Administration, the agency that oversees the disposal of federal real property that federal agencies no longer need. In the legislative proposal that they sent to Congress in July, DoD basically asked Congress to give it the ability to bypass much of the current GSA property disposal process, which is very lengthy, so it can sell its property a lot quicker and it could have a lot more flexibility to spend that cash. The legislation would create this special treasury account where cash received from those sales would be deposited.
What does DoD envision spending that cash on?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. We don't have a lot of details, but the proposal says that DoD could use that money for any installation management or infrastructure-related projects that the Defense Secretary deems to be in the interest of national defense. So that is very broad. But DoD officials did say that they want to be able to sell the property to rapidly, on a pay-as-you-go basis, upgrade and modernize infrastructure such as barracks. They want to modernize port infrastructure, as well as sensitive compartmented information facility and special access program facility space. The money would also go towards the Trump administration priorities, such as Golden Dome, the missile defense system. They also want to be able to spend that money on southern border operations, and they also want to allocate that money for the development of AI data centers. On top of that, they want to be able to transfer that money, if needed, into existing procurement or research and development accounts.
So if I understood you right, they're asking for the permission to be able to sell property without oversight. Would they need oversight to spend the money that they generate from those sales, or would Congress have to get involved or not?
So it sounds like they would have a lot of freedom. However, the proposal does say that there would be some oversight. Basically, DoD would have to notify the Congressional Defense Committees at least 14 days before completing a sale and certify that that transaction is advantageous to the United States.
So could the Pentagon then also sell a property and continue to use it, lease it back?
Yes, that's actually what they want to do. They want to be able to lease back some of the sold facilities for up to 50 years, and that's the authority that they're also looking for. But they do want to structure those sale leaseback agreements in a way that would reduce the upfront budget impact of long-term leases. So certain long-term lease commitments require the government to have significant costs up front, or they would have to recognize a long-term liability. But what the proposal is trying to do is to require DoD to pay rent for a leaseback only annually.
Are there other property management changes in this legislative proposal?
Yeah, so kind of related to this, DoD is also asking Congress to give them greater flexibility to use cash that they generate from leasing their own property. So this is a little bit complicated, but stay with me. They're asking to remove the $500,000 annual cap on what it can pay to lease space back from a private developer. So basically, DoD says it has prevented the department from pursuing larger enhanced use lease projects on military installations. What DoD envisions here is basically it leases its land to a private developer through an enhanced use lease. The developer finances the project rather than DoD doing it by itself, using its construction funding, hiring contractors, etc. DoD then leases some of that new or renovated space back. But right now, that leaseback prevents DoD from committing to more than $500,000 annually. And there is another part to this where DoD wants more freedom with the money it receives from leasing its property. Also, similarly, it wants to use that cash. It wants that cash to be deposited into the special treasury account for 5 years. And it also wants to use that money kind of similarly in a similar fashion for installation management and infrastructure projects. They also want to be able to transfer that money to R&D accounts and procurement accounts.
Do they have an estimate of what it would cost to move in this direction?
So far, they say these proposals would not have any impact on the resources requested within the 2027 president's budget.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for the update.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, who says the federal government should own part of a private company? That's no longer a theoretical question. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Commerce Department recently announced plans to take minority equity stakes in companies receiving federal support. It's a sign of how government is taking a more direct role in developing strategic technologies. And joining me now to discuss the opportunities and the risks is Joel Fetter, Managing Director at Clark Street. Joel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Very nice to be here.
The government just announced it was taking equity stakes totaling more than $800 million in 7 companies in the semiconductor industry. I'm old enough to remember that government's main role used to be fairly straightforward. It funded research, it set the rules, and it let the markets sort out the rest. What has changed now that has agencies taking direct stakes in companies instead of just providing incentives?
There's really an evolution in how people are thinking about the relationship between the public and the private sector. And like you, I was raised on the idea that government wasn't the solution. Government was part of the problem. But we're in a different world now. We're in a world where there's a lot more competition between ourselves and some of our key strategic adversaries for this production capability. And I think it's really raised the question of what is the most appropriate way to align resources to achieve things that are in the national interest. And so this wave of equity investments that we're seeing is really part of that experimentation for how do we drive things faster, quicker, in a way that is more secure for American supply chains.
Many of these recent investments have been made under the auspices of the CHIPS Act. And a lot of folks would argue that Congress never intended the funding that it provided through the CHIPS Act to be used for direct equity stakes in companies, that it was supposed to be incentives or grants. How do you respond to that? What did Congress really intend? And are these investments in line with the statute?
Well, I certainly can't opine what Congress intended because I wasn't in the room where those happen. Certainly you can see the language that is in the bills, and it is novel, right? But there is, I think, a very compelling argument that needs to be explored, which is if the government's going to go make large-scale investments in value-producing enterprise, why should those just be grants? Why shouldn't the government consider an equity stake, whether an equity stake directly or or as a warrant, so that the future growth of those enterprises could be monetized and potentially plowed back into new investments in the American base. So far from me to opine on the legal questions. I think that's a domain for others to explore. But the fact of expanding the concept of programming to include those is one that we're seeing in other countries, and maybe it's time to start exploring with what that looks like here.
I think my rejoinder to your hypothetical there would be that government is not supposed to be in the business of shifting the market or of picking winners and losers, and that when it takes equity stakes, it does in fact put its thumb on the scales of free markets. And while other countries may do that, historically that's been against the norms in the United States. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it has been against the norms of the United States. There's two features to I think the bulk of the equity investments. First is that they're non-controlling by and large. I think there's a golden share in the U.S. Steel deal, but most of them are roughly 10% acquisitions. So the government is a shareholder, but it's not necessarily sitting there, as I understand it, in the boardroom dictating strategy or policy. So the control of these enterprises remains firmly within the private sector leaders, just as it always has been, to mobilize the resources to focus on cost discipline, et cetera, to build out businesses that will succeed. And the government's sort of a passive investor. In terms of the appropriateness, I think it really goes back to a questioning of what the role of government is. And we were raised in an environment where I think there was a lot of competition. The Cold War, Russian state-owned companies were not necessarily deemed to be, world beaters. They were not seen to be as innovative. And we're in an environment now where we're competing against the Chinese, which have shown a remarkable ability to blend public capital with sort of mercantilist industrial policy to capture large portions of really crucial markets. So to be looking at it, through the lens of what's the appropriate application of that concept here in the United States within our economic structures, it's a question that begs asking.
Joel Fetter is managing director at Clark Street. So, Joel, let's take it one more step. Even if the government stake is non-controlling, what does that say to investors and the market if the government itself is taking a stake in one of these companies?
So far, it's said a lot and quite positive. If you look at the ability of companies to go out and raise capital on public markets after the announcement of a deal, it's been very high. So far, we've seen a very favorable response to many of these deals.
And what happens if, as the terms play out, those companies lose money?
That's a topic that we'll have to see how that evolves. If they lose money and the government stake is underwater, somebody who's been cutting these deals might say, well, look, if it was just a grant, we would have lost the money anyways. But at least this way we have a stake that we could cash in and move to some other investment that is aligned with our priorities.
It certainly seems as if in the near term, at least, this is going to be a new norm for this administration. If it continues to take a more active role like this in investing in an equity way, are there safeguards that become more important, controls, balance that you would want to make sure you see in place?
Absolutely. The government being a shareholder in these companies and having a fiduciary interest in their outcomes, there are areas where it will rub up against potential conflicts. If it has a stake in, say, a nuclear company, and it's also regulating that nuclear company, how does that play out? What are the appropriate firewalls within the government to ensure that happens? If you're putting money into mining companies, what's the appropriate way to ensure that interest is advanced from the government's fiduciary interest, fiduciary perspective, while also ensuring that environmental reviews and considerations like that are still, the public interest is still safeguarded through the other avenues of government.
The examples you just raised are clear examples of cross-agency coordination where one agency may take an equity stake, but another is the regulator or the oversight body or the auditor eventually. Are you seeing any evidence yet that agencies are thinking about those internal controls and cross-agency collaboration to establish those guardrails early before something happens?
We've urged all our clients that are in this space that they really need to consider their actions within the context of a conventional operating environment. So if you have to go through NEPA procedures, you should absolutely go through those NEPA procedures, not considering whether the government may or may not have an equity stake, because oversight, remains a tool of Congress that they will use. And then there's also state and local considerations. You want to make sure that your project is not going to get high centered on agitated, local stakeholders that feel like the government isn't looking out for their interests, so it's now their job to do that.
Do you feel like in federal agencies there is the existing expertise to manage these kinds of investments? Who's got the responsibility for ensuring returns?
I've been extremely impressed with the quality of the people that have been brought in from investment banking to underwrite these deals in particular. That is the initial phase of this, the underwriting phase. We're going to move next into the management phase, and the government will need to recruit and retain a cadre of personnel that is able to monitor these investments and make judicious decisions about how to manage those.
All right, so we're starting this sort of adventure with some high-tech, chips in Silicon Valley sorts of companies, but the expectation might be that the market horizon will expand. We might find ourselves in quantum or fusion or advanced manufacturing. What will tell us over the next few years whether this investment approach is actually paying off in the way we think it could?
It will show that it's paying off to the extent that we are able to actually validate the accelerated timelines that are achievable under public-private collaborations of a significant scale. So to the extent that we're actually able to get fusion companies away from, towards the demonstration of a first of a kind, to the extent that we are able to get semiconductor fabricators, fabs up and running that are economically competitive, that are producing chips that people want to buy at a price point they can afford, that will be the determining factor.
And if you're GAO or an IG, what are you doing right now to have conversations with your agency leadership to make sure that they're thinking ahead for your eventual visit?
Yeah, GAO and the overseers, the oversight bodies, they have a significant role going forward, and they're going to have to staff up as well because the types of questions that will need to be answered around diligence, around how equity is being managed, are different from the ones that they've had to handle before. And there are these legal questions that you pointed out that will also factor into what their findings may be. So their role will be redefined as well. And this is one of the things that's really exciting about being a government executive in this period, is that you really have the opportunity to put your finger on the scale on how this goes, whether it's a thing that works, whether it's an experiment that works, or whether it's one that is challenged.
Joel Fetter is Managing Director at Clark Street. Really appreciate you joining me today. This is going to be an exciting area to watch, so appreciate your insights.
It's a fascinating conversation.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, financial regulators usually write rules for existing markets. Tokenized finance is forcing governments to coordinate rules for one that's still being built. But first, as government takes a bigger role in shaping emerging technologies, Congress is trying to write rules for one that's changing faster than the legislative process. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than many institutions can adapt. For Congress, the challenge is deciding where government should step in and where it should stay out while the technology's full impact is still emerging. Joining me to discuss that challenge is Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia's 8th District. Congressman Beyer, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Terry, thank you very much.
You've recently introduced a number of bills: AI security, federal workplaces, congressional oversight, and the Foreign Service. At the surface level, those might seem all unrelated, but I suspect you've got some consolidated issues you're trying to address. Talk to us about what's concerning you these days.
Well, I guess the biggest thing is affordability, and not all of those address it. But for example, I introduced a bill that career Foreign Service officers who were fired or riffed, dozed, and get to come back. Because even now, State Department, I saw where more than half the ambassador slots in the world are open right now, U.S. ambassadors, that they come back, they don't have to take the Foreign Service test again. Many of them will remember how painful that was when they first took it in their 20s or their 30s, the oral and then again the written. It seems inappropriate to ask somebody who's been doing the job for 20 or 30 years to go through that whole basically college entrance exam type thing again. And that's affordability, because we want those people to be able to work. And certainly we want our best foreign service officers back in place. Is it
affordability for the employees or also affordability for the State Department? Because there would be some pretty significant expenses involved in retraining an entire foreign service cadre.
Jerry, you're absolutely right. And of course, as we know, in almost every job, most people don't hit their stride till they're a year in and get to be really expert until they're 3 to 5 years in. So when you start all over, I mean, yes, we need to have young people who intend to make it a career, but we don't want to throw away the people who have so much background already, who understand the nuances of the various countries in which they've served.
A couple of your proposals here seem to be about visibility, one on AI flaw reporting as an effort to identify emerging vulnerabilities, and one about congressional oversight and its support. Is part of your concern that government is maybe operating with less visibility or transparency than it should be?
Oh, I absolutely believe that, Terry. And we're seeing that now. I don't want to be too partisan, but I think most observers would say that sadly, this is potentially the most corrupt administration ever. It makes Teapot Dome just look insignificant. With the president making $1.4 billion in his first year and what's happening. So the only way you really deal with that as citizens is transparency. We have pushed with Republicans for years to have transparency on all White House visitor logs, who's coming to see the president and the like. Specifically, the things you brought up were after two of the open AI broke out of their sandbox and attacked Hugging Face 2 weeks ago. And then Anthropic had to confess that one of theirs broke out and did 3 different incursions into databases that were not theirs. We know that as AI evolves, there are going to be lots of flaws and mistakes and dangers. So it's really important that there be a transparent national reporting system, that when something bad happens, everybody knows about it. Everybody has a chance to fix it. NIST out in Gaithersburg, our National Institute for Standards and Technology, has long had the same kind of thing for cybersecurity breaches. So, when Apple discovers, oh my goodness, somebody can do this to your phone, we're all notified right away and taught how to fix it. That's not yet happening with AI, but that's what we want to try to do.
The White House has announced a new AI evaluation framework, but it hasn't released it per se. Do you think that we have sufficient transparency there in how they're trying to evaluate and approve AI models before public release?
Yeah, we don't, but I'm sympathetic. It's not an easy thing to figure out. I tend to come down pretty strongly on the side of open AI architecture. And interestingly, China who is our big competitor, they've pushed really hard on not the secretive closed systems like Anthropic or Gemini or Meta, but those that are open that people around the world can use, sort of sharing, okay, we've developed this and now we're basically giving it to the world. You see that sometimes the difference between Firefox or Brave, the open architecture systems to manage your email and your searches. It's a very generous way to do it, but also it's really helpful because then if there's a problem, if somebody discovers, you can fix it for everybody right away too. The problem is that those closed models like Anthropic have so much money invested in them that the White House is concerned about not forcing them to be open and risk all that money that's invested. And also they're trying to understand the dynamic of open versus closed in terms of the competition with China.
Congressman Don Beyer represents Virginia's 8th District. Well, let's pull on that transparency thread a little bit because, as you say, we're concerned from a security perspective, but we also want to support the market space here. What do citizens need to know, separate maybe from the industry players and the government, about how these AI models really work?
Well, I love the way you frame that because the truth is even the smartest Nobel Prize winning AI scientists don't know how they work or why they work. And so for us humble human beings, it's really tough. I think the really important part is that as citizens, we keep our eyes very open about not just the glories of AI, and there are glories. The breakthroughs in medical science right now are astonishing. Mathematics, I'm reading all these interesting papers this week about mathematicians who fear there's be no need for PhD mathematicians anymore because the machines are so good at figuring out unproved problems centuries old. However, we need to be sensitive to what AI does to privacy, basically destroys it, what it does to the dangers of job elimination. We don't know how much job displacement there will be, but certainly that may be most people's primary fears about AI. What does it do to the college education I just paid for? And then I've tried to make sure that we pay attention to the existential risk. If OpenAI's models can break out and steal somebody else's data, what happens with what they call, Terry, the alignment problem? What if we get artificial superintelligence whose values aren't the same as ours? And I know a lot of people are trying to figure out how do you train human values into them? But as we know, even on this planet, there's a lot of variation in human values. What the people in China value is different from the people in Iran value, which is different from us in the United States and Western Europe.
That's so important. And so outside of what we hear in most of these conversations, let's pull on some of those particulars that you just talked about: privacy, job market, value of a college education. As you are sitting in Congress today, what do you think are the most important focus areas from a legislative perspective that we should be thinking about?
On artificial intelligence, we're trying to get, one big important bill that folds in a bunch of those different pieces. That the safety issue, to make sure that we're not growing the artificial intelligence models so quickly that if they get out of control, that we can't rein them back in. There was an effort in the last week or so on a kill switch bill. Probably not the right bill, but a good faith effort to be able to turn the machines off if they start getting dangerous. I'm thinking really deeply about what our workforce looks like. When artificial intelligence agentic agents can do so many of the things, what are we going to do? What does it mean? Where's the dignity of work come from? How do people get paid? How do we make sure that artificial intelligence serves humanity rather than humanity serving the artificial intelligence? So there are many different pieces of that. And I'm hoping, including, Terry, the most easiest one, which is we can't let artificial intelligence run wild with sexual imagery and not control it. And the very first bill we passed, the Take It Down Act, sponsored by Ted Cruz, of all people, is the first really major bill that we've passed.
As you're describing that, it feels like there should be general agreement. But of course, you've got to work in a bipartisan fashion to get agreement across the aisles there in Congress to move these bills forward. Where have you been surprised by the commonality of agreement, and where have you been surprised by the areas of disagreement?
It's been a hill and a valley and a hill. 2 years ago, Terry, we had a bipartisan AI commission in the House. 12 Dems, 12 Republicans, a unanimous report with 80 specific recommendations. That was a high point. The low point then followed with Majority Leader Steve Scalise saying, no regulation ever. And then Donald Trump coming in as president's second term, basically saying nothing that will be a barrier to innovation. And so we had a Wild West perspective. When Anthropic released Mythos a couple of months ago, the administration suddenly woke up and said, oh my God, if they had just released this to the general public, all the cybersecurity of our banks and our major financial institutions would be moot after a day or two. The whole world financial system could come crumbling down. So now we're climbing a new hill where Democrats and joined by Republicans believe that government regulation is essential.
And as you think about the remainder of this current congressional term and the next Congress, what will you hope to get across the finish line when it comes to AI legislation?
Terry, I'm not optimistic we'll get anything done this year. I think we only have about 3 weeks of actual time in Washington before the midterm elections. And after the midterm, it's a lot of cleanup, trying to make sure there's a budget for next year. However, we do want to use these next 4 or 5 months to bring together Democrats and Republicans on what the framework will look like, hopefully in the first quarter of 2027, that we can get a good bipartisan bill and bicameral that implements all these different really important elements.
Congressman Don Beyer represents Virginia's 8th District. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today. Good luck.
Terry, thanks for your thoughtful questions. Good luck with the podcast.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, financial regulators usually write the rules for existing markets. Tokenized finance is forcing governments to coordinate rules for one that's still being built. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Technology doesn't stop at national borders, and increasingly neither can regulation. A new U.S.-UK effort to coordinate oversight of tokenized finance highlights the challenge of creating rules for markets that are still taking shape. Joining me to discuss it is John Kearney, Director of Product Management at My Compliance Office. John, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Great to be here, Terry.
Recently, the U.S. and the United Kingdom unveiled what they're calling a joint roadmap to coordinate digital asset oversight. Before we jump into the whys and wherefores of that, can I ask you for a very quick primer on those digital financial assets and what people are calling tokenization?
Yep. So tokenization, it's a whole new frontier. I'll give you an example. We're all very familiar with stocks, say Tesla stock, for instance, and you can currently buy that at any brokerage in the US or in the UK, for instance. But there's been a change in that where we're now taking those stocks where firms are custodying that one security that you're talking about, and then they're issuing a token for that. The big benefit of that, of course, is that you can then trade that 24/7, right? So it's a tokenized security, and it has a whole load of new capabilities because of that. So that's really, the premises of tokenizations. You can take one asset and you can tokenize it, and you can then trade it 24/7 or internationally.
That movement of the financial markets to a 24/7 global continuous market is really a change. And in this case, why is it so important, or what's significant about the United States and the UK deciding to coordinate their approach to tokenized finance?
Well, I mean, what's really significant about it is that, typically when any new regulations come out, they're typically in one jurisdiction, right? This is two jurisdictions, probably the two biggest jurisdictions when it comes to, I would say, the securities markets are coming together and coordinating, what they're going to do before they really put their frameworks in place around how they're going to deal with tokenized assets. So that's alignment allows them to have standardization across both regimes instead of trying to come together after the fact, which, typically is hard to do and, typically ends up with a lot more costs coming into play if you're trying to retrofit something after you've put regulation in place in two different jurisdictions.
Right. Very much going back to that 24/7, anywhere, anytime open market. If the U.S. and the U.K. didn't coordinate, if they took different approaches to regulating this kind of financial asset, what would be the consequences? Would firms sort of gravitate to whichever market had the most favorable regulations?
That's a very good question. Mostly no, I would say. Look, the large firms are already duly regulated. They can't really pick one. What you would probably see on the fringes is certain firms going to the less regulated one. But in general, what the end result would probably be that firms would end up having to have two approaches to how to handle regulation and compliance. And, there'd be extra costs that would come with that. So, for instance, in the industry we're in, where we're managing employee conflicts of interest, it would result in firms either trying to manage, how they monitor digital assets in the UK in one way and doing it slightly differently in the US. Or what some firms do is they tend to implement the most stringent restrictions. And, the end result of that, of course, is that individuals who are innocently then getting hit with the harder restriction just because they happen to be in the jurisdiction that has the less stringent controls in place.
John Kearney is Director of Product Management at My Compliance Office. John, one of the questions that comes to my mind here, especially a challenge for regulators, is that this arena is really evolving, and it's evolving quickly. As you're trying to set regulation, is there enough certainty for markets at this point, or do you risk over-regulating at a time when you're not quite sure which direction it's going?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my take on this is, like the answer is yes, no, I guess, right? But my approach to this is really, for regulators to really put in principles rather than putting strong rules in place early on and then potentially add in those rules as more certainty comes into what's happening. Also, like focusing in on regulating the function or behavior and not really focusing in on the technology ends up with less risks that you'll have problems later. So in the business we're in, right, conflicts of interest, a conflict of interest, exists, whether it's tokenized security or whether it's a traditional financial asset. So, the fact that somebody could have insider information and trade on it, that's still going to exist with tokenized securities as it did with traditional assets. And, the approach should be to focus in on the conflict of interest and not what way it was. It happened.
Are there certain principles or assumptions that you're seeing made right now in this joint policy statement that might be at risk because of the rate of change of the technology and the products here?
So on this, look, I think the way they're focusing on this, the approach here is they're very much focused in on, I would say, items that are not that controversial. Like they're focused in on what I would say is the boring areas of finance, which are things like settlement. So I think there's probably not a huge amount of risk that they're going to end up putting something in place that they're going to have a problem with. I think what they're doing is fairly smart. It's an area where I think they'll all potentially be able to agree because it's something that is kind of the basis of how the financial markets work. So I'm not concerned that we're going to have a problem there.
We're talking a little bit about the complexity of international agreements on this sort of framework and rules for financial markets. What is the role of the private sector here? How are the banks and the financial industry coming in and providing input? Are they into this conversation?
Yeah, well, I think in the US, we're seeing a strong debate around the Clarity Act. We've got lots of different voices coming into play, and I think that's healthy, to be honest. I know it's been quite fractious in some cases, and a lot of people have strong opinions, but I think that's healthy, and it's something that has to happen, that people air their voices. And that is happening, in the US with the private sector. And I think what really works there is if you have transparency, you bring in as wide an audience as you possibly can. You bring in, the technology providers, the large players, the small, the medium players, you get their input, and, you make it public so that, there's transparency in place and everybody can see what inputs are being put into the debate and where it ends up.
Certainly here in the U.S., there's a lot of tension always between the regulators and the market players themselves, and we think that that's a good thing, but there's always room for going back and forth. I'm not nearly as familiar with the U.K. markets, but I will assume that that's a characteristic of those markets as well. How, if you're a regulator, do you stay close enough to industry developments to write these kinds of workable rules without really allowing the industry to effectively write the rules itself?
Yeah, so look, I think a lot of it is taking, the regulators taking an approach as to what their objective is out of it. From the side of it that I'm coming from, it's conflicts of interest. It's the regulators' role, in my opinion, is to make sure that there's transparency and fairness in the market. So their objective should be to make sure that that's what happens. How it works in practice is what you're going to get from the players. So we should be looking to them to actually provide the information on that. and then the regulators provide what the objective is. And, going back to what I was saying, keeping transparency there, recording what everybody said, what their inputs were, and, keeping everybody honest through that transparency, I think is a key to the whole approach.
This seems like a very foundational document and agreement. If it plays out, what do you expect to see in this tokenization space a couple of years from now? Will we have built on this foundation? Will we have changed it completely? What's going to happen to the market?
I think it provides, the opportunity for cross-border tokenized securities to work, right, without needing a legal opinion on, what happens in the UK, what happens in the US, and just transparency on that, and also consistency on that, so that people know how it's going to work. I think it'll be good from the industry from that point of view. It'll also provide clarity to the market around things like, what is a security, what's not a security. That's been pretty vague for the last few years, not just in the US, but also worldwide. From the industry that we're in and the customers that we have, provides the opportunity to just have one control framework, not two in place, to be able to standardize the controls you have in place around conflicts of interest and not have multiple controls, which are costly to keep. And I suppose, look, the reality is, if in 5 years' time, when we come back and look at this, if the compliance team is able to just have one control or remove one control from what they had to have in the past, because these two jurisdictions came together, that would be a good thing.
I've been speaking with John Kearney, Director of Product Management at My Compliance Office. John, I really appreciate you giving us a practitioner's eye into what's a really complicated issue. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Terry. Really appreciate talking to you, and wish all your listeners a happy future with digital assets.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The intelligence community just launched a shared classified jobs portal. IC Jobs is just like USA Jobs, but for those with top secret security clearances. The goal is to help the intelligence community put the right talent in the right work roles. Justin Doubleday, Federal News Network's reporter, joins me now with more details. Justin, explain to me how a top secret jobs portal is actually going to work.
Yeah, well, I don't have a top secret clearance, so I'm not going to be able to look at it, but this will be available to anyone in the intelligence community with one of those high secret clearances. Doug Casa, the IC Chief Information Officer, said that IC Jobs launched several weeks ago, and it's been adopted so far by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office, with more to follow, he hopes. Casa broke this news at the DOTIS Worldwide Conference down in Tampa, Florida, just this past week. And of course, the launch of this internal jobs portal, which is obviously what it is, requiring a top secret clearance, it comes as the IC has seen a lot of turnover during the Trump administration, some hiring freezes. Officials have sought to also downsize the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and return many of the employees who are on detail there back to their home agencies. So there's a lot of kind of churn within the intelligence community's workforce right now. And I guess this IC Jobs portal might be a way for the intelligence community to make sure that all those people who have kind of been moving around, maybe moving up because people are leaving, can identify good opportunities perhaps at other agencies across the intelligence community.
It sounds like a way to sort of shuffle the personnel deck amongst the players who are already there. But is there a bigger picture or a bigger vision of how this will help the intelligence community?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's kind of reshuffling the deck. It's a little bit of a shift in terms of what we've heard IC leaders talk about for the last really 5-10 years. It's all been about recruiting tech talent, bringing in, younger people out of college. And that is certainly still a priority. But there's also an element here of like, all right, we've got who we've got. Let's try to hang on to them too. And, the intelligence community tends to also be a little bit siloed. And there are 18 intelligence agencies. Oftentimes in the past, you would work at one your entire career, 30, 40 years even. Now there seems to be more of an emphasis on, all right, we've got a talented person here. Maybe they're getting a little burnt out at the National Security Agency, but maybe they want to find a job somewhere else. And Casa really put this in terms of the artificial intelligence race, the AI race with China. It's all about making sure that you have that uber talented person in the right job to find, to work on the right problem.
If you look at where we are competing around the world in AI today, it is not in the technology necessarily. And look at it in industry right now. It's in the people. It's in the skill sets. It's bringing the right skills in to develop purpose-built models to deploy. And the only way you're going to do that is by managing your hiring and your allocation of those personnel resources across the community more effectively.
What else did you hear at the conference or from the conference about how the intelligence community is approaching the risks of AI?
Well, cybersecurity is obviously a big concern for the IC and for the IC CIO in terms of how the IC is going to adopt AI, deploy AI agents and things like that. And one thing Kosa mentioned is that zero trust is becoming more and more important as a concept. It already was kind of the central cybersecurity concept, but with AI and AI agents, it's kind of taken on a little bit of a paradigm shift and a little bit of even heightened importance for how the intelligence community will adopt AI. He said that the IC is investing in a new community-wide enterprise service for identity management, making sure that you're properly identifying not just human users, but, machines and AI agents and things like that, and ensuring that they are accessing the resources, the IT data and things like that they should be able to access, and only that. Casa talked about how they're going to pilot and test those shared identity management tools starting this fall. And this is all rolling up into kind of a shared zero trust paradigm across the intelligence community.
We tend to think of cybersecurity as friction prohibiting a function from occurring. But in reality, if we do zero trust how we've defined it, which is getting your identity down and doing fine-grained entitlements to get data exactly where it needs to go to the individuals and the functions that need it, it becomes a key mission enabler. And so we have to flip our paradigm in that regard as well.
So beyond these topics, are there other areas where the ODNI wants to see better integration across the intelligence community?
Yeah, Casa mentioned a couple other areas. One is in DevSecOps. That's the software development kind of pipeline model that all agencies have really been moving toward if they haven't adopted already. Casa said that the ICCIO's office wants to put in place a kind of shared infrastructure and shared resources for DevSecOps across the intelligence community, and that will be happening in the near term. The second area is in financial systems. He said that's an area that's ripe for automation within the intelligence community, and you have all these different systems within the IC right now, all kind of manual. And what they're looking to do at ODNI is to not only replace the legacy system that they have in place right now, but then to automate how data feeds into kind of a central financial system and architecture moving forward. So those are two other areas where you're seeing the IC CIO's office really try to spearhead kind of this intelligence community-wide approach to specific technology areas.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for bringing us up to speed. This sounds like an ambitious agenda.
Yeah, it certainly does. Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.